All right, everybody, welcome to this Tuesday afternoon office hour, West Coast time at least, and another double header to come today. I want to talk about both the unfolding fire weather and lightning event in Northern California, which is already underway. I'll have a radar and satellite tour, among other on-screen information sharing later, but I also want to talk about what has become sort of a continuously escalating cycle of breaking news regarding what's going on in the federal government, and in particular this week, what is going on with NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, that is home to the National Weather Service, as well as many other weather, climate, and ocean-related entities, as the name implies. And I actually want to lead with that today because I know there are some folks joining from a national audience who may have a slightly less interest in the California specifics. So I promise I will get to the weather in the short term, talk about the lightning, the fire weather. I can assure everyone that right now, last I checked about 5 or 10 minutes ago, there were no immediately emergency situation wildfires, so I won't jump into that right now. That'll be the second half of the session today, so stay tuned for that radar and satellite and watch duty fire map tour. So I wanted to begin by discussing what has transpired this week, and it isn't even the thing that's primarily in the news today, which is, of course, the passage of the highly contentious piece of legislation through the Senate. It now moves on to the House of Representatives. But although there are lots of quite alarming things even in that piece of now at least Senate passed legislation, that is actually not primarily what I'm talking about today, because that was not an appropriations bill for that included NOAA. So that is yet to come later this summer, and I just looked it up. The timetable for discussing the NOAA appropriations relevant bill is later now in this month. Today is July 1st. We're now in July. That is likely to come in the second or third week of this month. The reason I raise this is that the appropriations bill that I'm about to discuss with respect to NOAA is not yet a done deal. In fact, it hasn't even made it through any chamber of Congress. This still has to be discussed and voted upon and then approved, presumably, by Congress before it would go into effect. And that's important context for what I'm about to talk about, because it means, A, that I'm talking in the future conditional tense here about what the consequences would be if this passes, either in its current form, God forbid, or even in a significantly quote-unquote compromise form. So even if half of what is in here were actually to make it into the final passed appropriations bill, it would still be a catastrophe for American weather and climate science, and also American meteorology, so basic weather prediction, understanding of climate change, and even, quite fundamentally, disaster preparedness and response. So that's the context for what I'm about to talk about. This is not related to the bill that was passed by the Senate today, and there has been some confusion regarding this online. That also means that there is still time for this to be, hopefully, dramatically walked back. I am concerned that on its current trajectory, given what we've seen recently in Washington, that we are on a path for much of this to go through. I would expect there to be probably partial carve-outs for individual senators or representatives who are key swing voters in Congress and make particular demands about facilities in their particular region or state or congressional district. But right now, there is an alarmingly clear trajectory for most of what is arguably very bad stuff for weather and climate relevant interests, and really for everybody, because weather and climate affects every single person in this country and on Earth, to make it through in final form if there isn't a pretty dramatic course correction in the near future. So the point is, this is very much a moment to contact your representatives if you have your own strong feelings about this. because it is going to affect everybody, and it's also not a done deal. But the current trajectory is not a good one. So what was announced, and I've talked previously about what was known as the Passback document, which is essentially a White House executive branch wish list. This was a couple of months ago when we were talking about these proposed cuts to NOAA, for example, and in particular NOAA research, weather and climate and ocean research. This is a more mature version of that proposal. And there were many folks who said, "Oh, there's no way that NOAA, because NOAA is the entity itself that is providing essentially a budget request to Congress. So this is the entity NOAA, the department or the agency, I suppose, within the Department of Commerce, making a request to Congress for how much money it's going to need to operate in the coming year, the coming fiscal year." So what is so concerning about this is this is no longer just a White House request to decimate NOAA, but this is in fact a call coming from inside the House, so to speak. This is NOAA itself administratively telling Congress to defund itself, essentially, saying we do not plan to engage essentially in almost any research on weather, climate, or oceans moving forward. So this is a big step from the White House sort of what was historically viewed as sort of a pie-in-the-sky wish list that almost never came to pass. This document, this proposed budget from NOAA is also still, in historical terms, considered to be sort of a first pass, one that is unlikely to be representative of what is ultimately passed by Congress. But I think I would caution that these are not times where historical precedent seems to mean very much, either legally or otherwise, and there is already abundant empirical evidence that we are headed for a situation where either NOAA itself or the Office of Management and Budget or elsewhere in the executive branch, there are ongoing and active efforts, and there have been stated, it's been stated publicly that this is a strategy that will likely be employed to essentially make an end run around Congress and implement many of the priorities that are outlined in this budget, even if Congress doesn't agree and does not zero out everything that is requested to be zeroed out in this budget. It's not necessarily going to protect NOAA in the way that I think some folks are assuming, because as we've already seen, for example, with reductions in force and the firing of both new and well-performing probationary employees, again, those employees who received promotions recently throughout NOAA and the Weather Service and in other federal agencies, that occurred without any reduction in funding for NOAA or the Weather Service from Congress. So that was not a congressionally mandated act. That was something that was done voluntarily and internally within NOAA and within federal personnel management to implement desired policy outcomes. So again, there is a strong reason to believe that this passback document is signaling, in addition to being a literal and direct request for funding from Congress that zeroes out much weather funding and literally all funding for both climate change and even just basic climate research, that there are other ways that these policy priorities may be implemented, even if Congress approves a significant amount of funding for these activities through things like what has come to be called pocket rescission, or there's a couple of other terms, including impoundment. I won't go into the details. I've had to do a little more research on how some of the finer details of policymaking and government works just to get through this. But the point is, Congress is in a position right now where it may well approve many of these catastrophic cuts, but it may not even take an act of Congress to actually see many of these implemented, because there is more than one way to shut down climate and weather research in this country, apparently, based on recent events. So that's a bit of the preamble. What is in the proposal? Well, the proposal is essentially, as I mentioned, to end 100%, literally zero out, all research conducted by NOAA OAR. So essentially the research arm of NOAA. It would actually cease to exist as an entity within NOAA, and it would receive $0 in funding moving forward. This is And, this was originally viewed, I think, by some folks as being a reorganization, that some of the stuff that used to be in OIR was going to go somewhere else. But this document from NOAA requesting funding for the coming year clarifies that no, the goal really is to end all research, period, on climate change, and frankly, almost all of the research into weather and oceans as well. Not literally 100% in those cases. It is literally 100% reduction for climate. But it's something like an 80 to 95% cut for weather and oceans as well. And that, too, was actually worse than requested by the White House even earlier this year. So this is a pretty alarming situation that has not gotten better with successive versions of these budget proposal and request documents. And I want to emphasize what this really means, because similar requests are being made for NASA, which is where a lot of other climate and some weather research occurs, as well as NSF, where a fair bit of climate and weather research is funded through universities, university partners. But this NOAA budget calls for closing essentially all government research labs that study weather, climate, or oceans in the United States and that are funded by NOAA, which is most of them. So this does in fact call for closing most weather, climate, and ocean research laboratories that have been supported by the federal government historically in the entire country, especially if you couple that with the additional reductions to similar programs in NASA and other federal agencies and departments. And so what does this mean in practice? Well, this means that at least, to my count, 16 different labs of international significance would all simultaneously close in the near future, potentially as soon as a month or two from now. This includes places like NSSL, the National Severe Storms Lab in Norman, Oklahoma, the singular world specialty center for studying severe thunderstorms, tornadoes, but also, I will add, fire weather. One of these is perhaps ringing more alarm bells in California than the others. Also, one of the world specialty centers, if not, again, the singular one, that studies hurricanes in Florida. So this is a Miami-based NOAA research center that has essentially been the locus for the development of almost all the specialized hurricane models that are used today all around the world. Completely shut down. Everyone fired. This also involves multiple NOAA research cooperative institutes in Boulder, Colorado. Atmospheric chemistry, atmospheric dynamics, weather, climate, fire prediction, you name it, it's gone. The cooperative institutes between NOAA and other universities all around the country, including ones that run the gamut from Hawaii to Alaska, to the East Coast, to the West Coast, and everywhere in between, all gone. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this is a wholesale attempt to end almost all of the research that we've been doing into weather, climate, oceans, fire over many decades. And a lot of the places that would be slated for almost immediate closure have been operating for decades, and in some cases, multiple generational scientific careers. We're talking about labs that have been operating for 50 to 75 years in some cases. These are things that the government has been funding and supporting for a long time, for many decades, that has spanned most of the development of modern meteorology and climate science since the middle of the 20th century. Some of these labs predate predictive weather models in any meaningful contemporary sense. They predate the existence of supercomputers going back into the mid-20th century. In fact, a lot of these labs were involved in the development of supercomputers, because one of the original use cases for developing extremely computationally sophisticated systems of computation that took up at the time whole basements and whole buildings was to predict the weather. This was viewed as a worthwhile endeavor. Apparently no more. And that's sort of where we are right now with the level of decimation that we would be talking about here when it comes to research funded by NOAA. Not just at the NOAA labs, those would be slated for closure, to be clear, but also all of the cooperative institutes that touch on weather, climates, and oceans that are co-hosted at universities all around the country. Also, the NOAA Sea Grant, gone. So that's just the beginning. But all of these projects that are in development, a lot of things, we're this close to big advancements. We're that close to having a new operational system. We're this close to improving prediction and early warning. We would end them weeks to months before successful completion. To what end? I don't think it's worth speculating further right now, but I'll leave that to the reader to dwell on for a moment. But this is obviously even worse in the context of everything else that's happening, because we know this is happening across agencies. We know that the proposals for NASA are NASA research, Earth system research, anything that relates to the climate of Earth, gone. NSF, the Geoscience Directorate and the Global Change Program, gone. We know this week that the National Climate Assessment website went permanently dark. You can still download archived reports elsewhere on the internet, of course, but everybody who was working on this program has been fired, or maybe more accurately dismissed, because most of these people were working in a volunteer unpaid capacity as scientists, but they're no longer involved. It's unclear what the future of the National Climate Assessment is. We may not have one moving forward, even though it is a report congressionally mandated, or worse, we may have one that is essentially a misinformation document, because the entire team of actual scientists who understand and have studied climate has been fired or dismissed. It's unclear who might replace them, but I have my suspicions. And we also see, the broader context, where even in the legislation that did clear the Senate today, again, it still has to go back to the House and then be voted on once more by the Senate, but that's usually not too much of an impediment. That signals a shift toward huge paradigm shifts in how this country is going to treat climate and climate issues and renewable energy and everything in between. And all of this is really part of a more coherent picture of not just achieving policy goals that you or I might personally disagree with, but really honestly seems more aimed at just decapitating American progress in science. It really is difficult to describe it in any other way. My colleagues in biomedical sciences have described the cuts in these fields to be similarly catastrophic and similarly bizarre in terms of the enormous self-inflicted wound that they represent. I was recently speaking to some meteorological and atmospheric science colleagues from France, and we used the very American expression to shoot oneself in the foot. Although in that context, I actually used the slightly more vulgar, even more American version of that expression to describe sort of what we're doing. But in any case, the real problem here is that the consequences will be largely irreversible if they go through. This is not something that I've said this many times, that moving fast and breaking things in this space does not mean that you get to swoop in and fix them in a day or two. Arguably, we wouldn't even want to do it if that was the case, but that's not what's happening here. Let me be really clear. If the cuts that are currently proposed by NOAA itself to NOAA, if this congressional budget request is anywhere near close to what actually transpires, even if it's half as bad as this, we will no longer have American leadership in weather, climate, or ocean science, period, moving forward. We will shutter many of these facilities at the peak of their productivity, the peak of their usefulness. And by one really shocking number, by the way, that some of my colleagues in hurricane science have dug up this week, and it really is a striking one, is that a recent study showed that the average value to the American economy from improved hurricane predictions over the last 20 or 30 years per storm, and again, in a given hurricane season, there's usually, more than one hurricane that threatens the U.S. coast, is about $5 billion per storm. $5 billion with a B for every single hurricane. And that's just one type of storm. That doesn't count atmospheric rivers or tornado outbreaks or flash floods or heat waves or severe fire weather events or anything else. That's just for one type of storm. Per storm. The net economic benefits not even of weather forecasting in general, but specifically of the improved track and intensity forecast for hurricanes in the last few decades, is $5 billion per storm. The entire budget request for all of NOAA for next year is less than $5 billion. So I just do not understand on any numerical, basic mathematical, arithmetic level how any of that pencils out, either from a perspective of efficiency, if you're worried about the return on a dollar of public investment, taxpayer investment, which it rightfully is known as, or if you're concerned about waste. Certainly doesn't seem like waste for me. To my perspective, if you can justify more than the entire annual budget with one storm for the entire organization. And by the way, most of NOAA is not involved in day-to-day weather prediction or weather or climate research. But that's already enough to justify the budget for the whole shebang. So my colleagues are rightfully freaked out about this because it really would spell the end of an era for reasons that don't really make any rational sense. There is no private sector that can swoop in and recover this. The private sector folks I'm speaking to are just as freaked out as the public sector folks. There is no clear path forward if anything close to this magnitude actually happens. And this is already occurring in a moment where we've understaffed a weather service to the point where it isn't operating 24 hours a day in some regions. I just checked the area forecast discussion for the weather service in Sacramento, and they still aren't able to offer a full forecast discussion, to my understanding, because they still don't have anyone to staff the overnight shift there. And, you know, there's some pretty active stuff going on in the Sacramento area of service right now that I'll talk about in the second half of this session. And I think, again, I don't relish in any way having a conversation that is primarily focused on the machinations of Congress and congressional budget requests. That is not what I set out to do, you know, in my public-facing role as a weather and climate scientist. But in this moment, there really isn't any separability between politics and actually sticking to the weather or talking about climate right now. As much as I wish there were maximal separation between those things, at least in this country, in the United States, that's not true, and it's really not true in this moment in particular. So thanks for bearing with me and being here because of that, or perhaps despite that. I really do appreciate that as well. And I know there are some of you who are here despite that, maybe even rolling your eyes a little bit at some of these statements, which I will say, all of these are factual based on the best of our knowledge what's going on right now. We don't have perfect knowledge either of what's going to happen because we can't predict the future that well. Remarkably, we can predict the future to a certain extent with weather and climate, but political futures are always more difficult to ascertain. But I think given what we've seen in the last few months, we do have to engage in some level of extrapolation rather than just saying, okay, this is what's happened up to the moment, and we have no idea what's going to happen next, because what's going to happen next is probably at least somewhat related to the motivations that we've seen and the actions we've seen in recent months. And I just want to harken back. I'm not going to belabor the point too much, because there are entire YouTube sessions that I've devoted to this as early as October last year before the last presidential election. But I just want to remind folks, again, that this is something that went under the radar a little bit, I think, at the time. I emphasized it in some of these live streams, but surprisingly, I've seen it brought up in a lot of the news coverage today. So perhaps it's finally hitting home more than it had been a little bit. But I think the quote that sticks in my mind from Project 2025, again, this is the section of the document that specifically describes why NOAA should be dismantled and why we should not engage in any sort of climate research or disaster preparedness, or arguably even try and predict the future when it comes to weather, is that there is this notion of the, quote, fatal conceit of planning for the unplannable. This notion that we cannot and should not ever try to predict the future in any capacity to avert bad outcomes. The notion that that is something that is bad to do or is not possible to do, which is, whether it's bad to do, I guess, is not as a matter of judgment, although that's a pretty incredible statement to my view. But the fact that the assertion that we can't do it is empirically false. We absolutely can. That's precisely where we get these statistics, like each correctly predicted hurricane is worth about $5 billion in losses averted and efficiencies gained to the American economy. If prediction was impossible, that would never actually come to pass. We would not have seen mass reductions in the number of people who die in weather-related disasters in this country over the past 4 or 5 decades, which we have. Disaster losses continue to rise for reasons that I can talk about another day. But the number of people who die in those events has plummeted. And why is that? It's because we've gotten really good at predicting precisely these quote-unquote unplannable events. Getting people out of harm's way, hardening infrastructure, getting people back in only when it's safe, that sort of thing. Even if you can't protect the property, hopefully in many situations you can still protect people's lives. And that's exactly what the mission of the National Weather Service is. It's one of the broader mandates of NOAA. So why do we want to get rid of all of this? I'll leave that as an open question, but I do encourage folks to essentially to reach out to your representatives, particularly if you're in a place where you perceive that it might make a difference. And I think that is more widespread than you might imagine, because to my understanding, there are a lot of members of Congress who might actually be quite inclined to fund the National Weather Service and NOAA research, who aren't fully aware of how catastrophic these cuts will be. And I think it's important to remember, by the way, that the bill that was just passed by the Senate today was over 1,000 pages long, hundreds of pages of which were written since last night. Members of Congress generally are not themselves able to read every single page of every document that they're voting on, which is a whole other problem. But sometimes they do rely on the information that they get from their staffers, certainly, but even from people, their constituents, who are reaching out to them and saying, you should really look into this or that detail of this thing you're going to be voting on soon or discussing, because it's not always obvious. And so there is a really important role for that. Will that be enough to stem the tide? Honestly, I don't know. It looks pretty grim right now. But again, this is not a done deal. This is not set in stone. And there is still time to do something about it. And as we've seen, public awareness still does matter in some of these spaces. And there have been walkbacks. There have been a number of specific policies, not in their entirety for the most part, but at least partially, that have been walked back from their most extreme form due to public outcry that becomes assimilated into essentially the viewpoint of various members of Congress. So there is another update, and this is a much briefer one, but this regards essentially the satellites that have been in the news this week, and the ones that the Department of Defense, they are not decommissioning the satellites right now, but they are decommissioning the ability of these satellites, which are originally classified pieces of instrumentation. The data streams from them are highly encrypted by the military. This is not something that was originally designed for civilian use, but there are meteorological instruments on these satellites that, in retrospect, had been declassified, including data that was previously classified by the military going back to the 1950s. So this represents a very long, contiguous data record up to the present. In fact, it's one of the longer meteorological satellite records that we have. The Department of Defense announced last week that they were going to suddenly cut off all public access, and by public access, I also mean civilian employees of the federal government. So they were going to cut NOAA off as of yesterday. Due to outcry, there was a partial reprieve, but really not much. The deadline was pushed forward a month, but now the plan is at the end of July, we are still going to lose access to scatterometer data, the SSMI sensor that is really crucial for specifically hurricane predictions and monitoring Arctic sea ice. So we are going to lose probably our best tool, about 50% of the information that we need of the scatterometer information that's out there to make these hurricane predictions in the middle, right at the peak of hurricane season. So I'm not quite sure what a month buys us, because a month-ish brings us closer to the peak of Atlantic hurricane season, and for that matter, Arctic sea ice loss season. Arctic sea ice, by the way, is running at a record low value for the date as of the last update when the satellite is still available. That's an entirely separate issue that does not have to do by any indication with funding, but is a whole different situation that is actively unfolding. So there are lots of fires burning, metaphorically at least, and I will get to the literal ones in just a couple of minutes here. So since I'm roughly halfway through the hour, right where I wanted to be with this, I do want to go through and look at the questions and comments and respond to some of them regarding the federal update. So I'm going to take a moment, take a sip of water, and then look through the questions up to this point, and then I'll move on to fire, weather, and lightning in Northern California. All right. There's a comment from Ben that the HR1 still needs to go to the House, where it will almost certainly be changed and then need to be voted on by the Senate again. That is true, but there is a lot of pressure right now to ram things through as quickly as possible. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of members of Congress who've been complaining that they haven't even read much of what is in these bills that they're voting on, which is partly a function of the extremely rapid back and forth and voluminous changes that have been occurring. So my concern is that something similar may unfold with the appropriations bill that does directly relate to NOAA funding next year, when that does come up in a couple of weeks. I'm not really sure why the dynamic would be much different a couple of weeks from now than it is today. There's a comment from Mrs. Blue Ocean, Ms. Blue Ocean, excuse me. I do not think there will be one regarding, I believe, the National Climate Assessment. Yep, and if there is, it'll be done by the Heartland Institute. To be totally honest, that is also my concern, is that really there are two outcomes. One is that there won't be one moving forward, which would be bad, but possibly not the worst outcome, which would be that it is conducted in a disingenuous way to offer what would essentially be disinformation. I wouldn't even use the term misinformation, because it would be deliberately wrong, deliberately misleading. And unfortunately, I have interacted with a number of folks with some of these entities and organizations. Again, these folks are very highly paid to sow disinformation. For perspective, some of the folks who are funded by some of these climate disinformation groups make, just on a consulting basis, somewhere between 5 and 20 times the average annual salary of an actual atmospheric scientist. And they have no scientific credentials at all. That alone should ring some alarm bells. Also, if a lot of emails in my inbox suggest that it's very important to follow the money, and I don't disagree with that, but that leads you to different places than a lot of people might often assume. A question, how much will other countries be able to take all of this over and continue? It varies. And the problem is it's so abrupt and chaotic. So abrupt transitions never result in smooth outcomes. But the other problem is the United States is a large and wealthy country. And it has historically been the leader in almost all of the weather and climate advancements over the 20th century, certainly, and for the first quarter, arguably, of the 21st. That is now rapidly changing as Europe and China especially make huge investments in the space. So what the US is doing in this moment is actively seeding that, I suppose. That is one way to look at it. But the problem is there is not perfect parallelism between the spin-ups in different countries. And as you might imagine, different countries are mainly investing in things that are in their own national interest, some of which spills over into other countries' national interest, of course, when it comes to something like a global weather prediction model or a global climate model. But in general, there are a lot of very U.S. specific things that no other country is going to pay for. What other country is going to pay for severe thunderstorm and tornado models that are primarily useful in the central and eastern U.S. during tornado season? What other countries are going to pay for hurricane models that are tuned particularly for the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Basin on the eastern coast of the U.S.? Again, there are other places that experience severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, although not as much as the central U.S. It is the world epicenter of that kind of weather. And there are other places that experience tropical cyclones and hurricanes and typhoons, of course. But again, none of this can be spun up overnight. This took decades of painstaking and sophisticated research to get to this point. Other countries are not going to be able to spin much, if not most of this up very quickly. And the ECMWF in Europe is becoming a global leader in some of the operational day-to-day side and on the climate side. So that is a bit of a bright spot in this, but it is a relative bright spot because essentially the reality is that the U.S. has had a much larger budget than any of these other countries. So other countries, Europe, China, they could double, triple, quadruple their budgets for a lot of this, and the level of investment would still be far lower than the U.S. has been making in these things over years. So unless other countries scale up their programs as radically as the U.S. is scaling down, then there will be enormous net losses for everyone in the world. And even if that happens, it will not happen instantly. We will lose a lot this year, next year, and the couple of years to follow at a minimum. Some of these programs took decades to spin up to the point where they are. There's physical infrastructure that's going to be scrapped and decommissioned if these budget proposals go through. Literally takes years to build. I mean, even if you had a contract ready and the construction started tomorrow, it would take years. Computing infrastructure, physical infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, aviation infrastructure. We're also going to defund all of the new aircraft that NOAA needed to do hurricane hunting missions. And by the way, those hurricane hunter aircraft also fly into Pacific coast storms and atmospheric rivers to do research and reconnaissance during California winter storms. So it just goes to show you, what other country is going to do that? What other country is going to pay for a fleet of military or ex-military aircraft to fly into hurricanes and atmospheric rivers for the benefit of the U.S.? The answer is, I don't think Canada or Mexico is going to do it. So it's a mixed bag, and the reality is there are only so many roles for this. Other people say, well, why don't American scientists just move to other countries? Well, first of all, that presumes a lot about the lives of individual American scientists. But second of all, there are probably 100 American scientists who are at risk of losing their job in this space for every one job that is open to Americans in other countries in this space. So yes, some of them probably will, but the vast majority will not. Some will move to the private sector, but even there, I've been speaking with folks in the private sector, and at the absolute maximum, there are perhaps 10 people for every one job. So what are the other 9 and 10 people in the space going to do? They may end up leaving the field or doing something different. And again, I wouldn't blame them. I mean, what choice do you have in that scenario? But what it means is they won't just do the same work somewhere else. That knowledge base, that capacity will probably be largely lost if all of this goes through. And that is one of the other concerns, is the generational loss of American expertise, of American knowledge and capacity that will be decimated across the board, across scientific sectors, whether climate, biomedical research, whatever it is in this scenario. And we're already seeing some of that unfolding before us right now. Mary comments that it's such a weird time to be an American interested in history. It's a weird time to be an American interested in a lot of things, I think, at this moment, that's for sure. Weather and climate among them. Yeah, and there's some comments from folks. I think it's generally good ethics to never wish disasters on anyone. You know, as some folks see it as cathartic, but I just see it as just a travesty that's a lose-lose. It's never good when disasters harm people. I think in any context, I think is fair to say. Just reading some more comments here before I move on. I have about 7 or 8 more comments just to skim through before I move on to the fire, weather, and lightning part of the discussion today with that radar and satellite tour. Daniel asks, could the state, presumably California or really any other state, although California is a big one that has more money than most, could the state step in and hire the laid-off NOAA workers? I've been asked this by folks, both within state governments and not, and the answer is not really, not anywhere near at the scale. Maybe 1,000th of them. And the question is also what the role would be, because unless you're going to stand up a national scale campaign for literally dozens of independent research labs that by design need to be geographically distributed, networks of radars all around the country, a fleet of satellites, supercomputing centers, and all of that, you simply cannot replicate what we will lose if these catastrophic NOAA CATs come to pass. So I think there are some interesting and innovative models. The state of New York, for example, does have a small team of meteorologists and disaster scientists and emergency response folks housed at SUNY Albany, sort of embedded in the atmospheric science department there, and that does provide some backstop for the federal National Weather Service capacity in New York. In fact, part of this was spun off following some really bad outcomes in New York City following various extreme rain and record-breaking storm events. I could foresee that being realistic and advantageous if California were to spin this up, but keep in mind that we're talking about a team of 5 to 15 people compared to the thousands of people who work within NOAA at different capacities. Even the Weather Service employs nationally a 4-figure number of people. That's a very big operation in the scheme of things, which is part of why it's such a travesty to lose it, because it took so long to develop and mature to the point that we have now. All right, a few more comments. Oh, a bunch more just came through, so I'm going as far as I can here, and I'll keep going. I'm not going to cut off at the hour if for some reason there's not enough time to talk about thunderstorms. So don't worry about that. All right, so I think that just about gets me to the end of the comments on this point here. And I'm going to go take a look at the current conditions, because there is something substantial going on right now in Northern California that I wanted to talk about in real time today. So as I've said before, the weather waits for no one, irrespective of what's happening in Congress, for better or for worse. Maybe that's for better, because at least that's predictable. Predictably unpredictable in the sense that it doesn't align with convenient times when it comes to politics. Okay, So I'm going to hop over now. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So you're gonna see the version of the screen where I'm in the lower right corner, and you're going to see some weather information on the screen. As always, it is helpful when folks share these streams when they're live. That's apparently what the YouTube algorithm likes, and so it's what the YouTube algorithm should get, I guess, if we want to grow the channel and the viewership. So I'll be, as I transition over, as I switch screens, this would be a good time to take a moment to do that. All right, there's my infinite mirror. And here we go. So the first thing you should see on your screen is live satellite imagery, again, brought to you by NOAA, a satellite collaboration between NOAA and NASA. In fact, this is the GOES 18 satellite, indicating that there have been 18 of them. GOES is an acronym that really reflects that it is a geostationary satellite, meaning that it's essentially orbiting at the same rate of the Earth's rotation, so it's constantly looking down at the same place. That's why, even though this is an animation over time, it's looking at the same region. In this case, it's Northern California, really the northern third of California. There's Lake Tahoe, there's the Oregon border, so we're sort of looking at this northern third of the state approximately on this map today. And there's a few features of interest that I wanted to show. First of all, folks are commenting the thunderstorm moving over Lake Tahoe. Well, another great example of an isolated thunderstorm over Tahoe. Look, it's literally enveloping the lake and surrounding areas, but it's literally sunny up here, over here, over here. So thunderstorms popping up. Not so unusual to see thunderstorms in early July over the crest of the Sierra or western Nevada, but more unusual to see storms in this region, so in northwestern California, where we're also seeing them. So there's a couple of pretty robust ones. This one has had some severe thunderstorm warnings issued, but maybe the more consequential ones are sort of in this area here, because these are unusual. In fact, we've even had some lightning strikes out over the coast, west of the north coast, from about central Mendocino County northward, in the overnight hours last night into the morning today. And this gives you a little bit of a sense of the direction of motion of these storms. Some of them are slow, but some of them are faster moving. But in general, they're kind of moving in this direction. And the reason for that, I'm going to zoom out now, is that there is a weak low pressure system off the coast that can be visualized better using water vapor imagery. So again, the center of the low pressure system is somewhere around here, and you can see how it's drawing up some subtropical moisture, and in this unstable region over northeastern California and adjacent portions of Nevada and Oregon, it's generating high base, so elevated showers and thunderstorms. So there's really dry air right now aloft over the Bay Area and Southern California, but this system has been able to draw in a fair bit of moisture from the south and east, and it's wrapping around the northwestern part of the low. So that's why it's muggy and cloudy up in Mendocino County right now, even with some isolated thunderstorms. But there's some fog along the coast, but above the fog layer, it's completely clear and very dry over the Bay Area. There's a few things going on, I think, that are a little bit apparent on this map too. And we have obviously, there's some storms going up along the northwestern mountains of California. There's storms going up in the Shasta area, northern and central Sierra. But the other thing that's interesting is that there's clearly a bit of some sort of wave or convergence boundary right along here that's allowing storms to fire even across the Central Valley and into the coastal mountains into Mendocino County. But there's also a developing sort of sub-disturbance, sub-vortex within this low, right around here. Do you see it? Do you see that little region of spin in the atmosphere, sort of with a little bit of localized, almost mesoscale cloudiness going on here? As this wave lifts northward late this afternoon into tonight, I think that there is a chance that there could be some thunderstorms really in this entire region of California and southern Oregon and western Nevada. So there could even be an isolated thunderstorm near Sacramento, just north of Napa or Santa Rosa, even a very slight chance of a few storms south of that. But in general, this region up here could continue to see thunderstorms into tonight. And the problem is some of these are on the dry side. There has been lightning occurring, although there has been precipitation associated with many of these storms. There is lightning occurring outside of the rain cores. And so what we see, I'm going to bring up radar imagery on the screen now, is kind of an interesting picture. So I'm going to go to a couple of different radar sites. Let me maximize this so it's showing up on screen. This is the radar from Beale Air Force Base. So again, in this case, the radar site is right around here. So it's looking outward from there. What we see here is that broken line of showers and elevated thunderstorms that I mentioned. So let me just draw that actually a little more clearly. It's sort of along approximately just north of that line. You can kind of see it. You can see there's not a ton of lightning around it right now, but there was just a lightning strike right near the, I guess the Mendocino, Tehama County border, somewhere near the Triple Point, up there in the wilderness there, pretty remote spot, and this has sort of been going on all day. So there's been a fair bit of lightning overnight hours into the afternoon hours in this portion of Mendocino County, north of Willits, and then again in the interior northwestern mountain region of California earlier. There actually have also earlier in the day, there's even been some lightning that made it off the coast, and there actually been a couple of lightning sparked fires even pretty close to the Highway 101 corridor along the north coast today. What we're also seeing up here, some pretty strong radar returns. Those are strong storms. The only good news about this is it's likely producing some real precipitation. These aren't very slow moving. So I actually don't think this cluster right in here is as likely to produce wildfires because it's raining pretty hard under them right now. In fact, I also don't see a lot of lightning strikes right now, although that might be because it's a little bit far. Let's check that out on another site. But then you can also see these phantom lightning strikes up in northeastern California with no precipitation echoes. Look at all that lightning. That actually does not mean that the storms themselves are dry. Look at what happens if we go over to the Reno radar. This was because of terrain blocking the beam. In fact, as you can see, there's actually a fair bit of precipitation associated with some of these storms. Although now, because the elevation of Reno's radar, as you would suggest, is elevated because Reno itself is a relatively high elevation city, these precipitation echoes are overstated. So it's not raining in a lot of the areas that shows reflectivity right now in these areas. It's mostly raining only where there's oranges and reds. The greens and blues are just virga that's evaporating. So as you can see, there's a lot of lightning in this cluster of storms, and a lot of lightning is associated with the rain cores, which is good, but there are also strikes that are falling outside of the rain cores. And look, anywhere where there's a lightning strike where there's not currently bright colors means that there's a lightning strike where it's not raining. Also some storms, pulse-type storms in western Nevada, and now it looks like something just blew up over Reno as we're talking. Again, some precipitation likely, but not a lot. And if we go further south, let's take a look at the Sacramento radar. Well, actually, let's go north first to Medford. There's some pretty robust storms up in the southern Oregon. In fact, there's a severe thunderstorm warning up there. Just north of Medford, I guess. I think that's right, or near Medford. Yeah, northeast of Medford. So there's active storms up there. Again, a lot of these are associated with rain, but since these are falling at the higher elevation forests and the Cascades, there's a pretty high risk of holdover fires, even if there is some rain up there. We see, okay, so it looks like there is now finally some lightning activity on that cell just north of Weaverville, but again, that one is associated with some pretty heavy precipitation, so this particular strike probably not going to start a fire, except for the low chance of a holdover. But again, you can see that there's a lot of activity around. And it looks like this cell, let's go down again toward, as I said, Sacramento, and this will give us a better look at some of these further south cells. The further south we go, the drier the storms actually get. And I know that's a little bit counterintuitive, but it has to do with the moisture profile. So look at this right here, just now. That's a dry lightning strike. You can see it occurring outside of the rain core. And this really, most of this is just sprinkles and virga evaporating before it reaches the ground. Not a lot of precipitation with these. So there's not as much lightning, but there are some dry cloud to ground strikes going on right now in northern Mendocino and in the mountains here. Also, a couple of cells trying to pop up in northern Lake County. Not seeing any lightning yet, but that could happen later. And again, there's a wave coming up from the southeast in this direction later today. So there could be a wave of isolated thunderstorms that essentially move sort of in a generally southeast to northwestward fashion, potentially into the evening. So just because you haven't seen lightning yet doesn't mean you won't potentially later today or in the overnight hours. In fact, sometimes it's known as nocturnal convection. Sometimes those elevated storms benefit a little bit from the transition from day to nighttime based on how the vertical temperature profile changes as the sun sets. So occasionally you get a pulse in lightning activity and even dry lightning activity in the overnight hours. That is very much something that we could see happen in this general region later today into tonight. And you can see that there's already some stuff going on, much bigger storms up in the mountains where you'd expect them, but there could be some activity elsewhere later today. Okay, so if we go to Watch Duty, the Wildfire app, taking a look at what's going on, I did enable the wind layer so you can see. Let me get rid of that. That's an old drawing. You can see the northwest flow along the coast, although notably it is now weaker near the Bay Area, for example, than it was in recent days. So you can see not a whole lot of northwesterly flow right along the immediate bayshore or the coastline of the Bay Area today. And so what this means is that the coastal upwelling is starting to weaken. In fact, there's been warming of nearshore ocean temperatures. They're still below average in this region right now, but they may warm more rapidly in the days to come. Okay, so just since I've logged in the hour I've been talking, there are multiple new wildfire starts in exactly the area that I just highlighted, and I suspect that these are likely all lightning related. So let's zoom in. We have, this one maybe isn't lightning related. This is a little bit too far south. This one looks like it's close to 101 corridor, just west of Hopland. So that's probably not lightning related, but it is a fire in Mendocino County. Nonetheless, it's small. It just started. These are the ones I would suspect are probably lightning related. Burning in snags on an eastern aspect. There has been a bit of precipitation. That sounds a lot like a lightning strike to me. A quarter acre, so that one's not moving too quickly yet. Another a 1 acre fire with fire on the ground and the trees. So these are fires that are mainly unstaffed. These are in pretty remote parts of the wilderness. So I mean, you know, there's a Forest Service road, it looks like, but that's about it. Some of these are probably occurring in the burn footprints of the Mendocino complex from several years back, which has now filled in with enough grass and brush to probably sustain contiguous fires. And as was mentioned in this case, with the kneecap fire, it's burning in snags, so that may even be in fire-killed trees from previous fires. So there are some presumptive lightning ignitions starting to pop up. Right now, these two probably are. I suspect there will be more. And then there are actually a greater number of them up in far northern California. These are all so far relatively small fires, but you can see that as the day has progressed, we've gotten more of these. There's actually quite a few, many of which are lightning related in southern Oregon. So this event is generating wildfire starts, and the event, the most widespread dry lightning may be yet to come, again, in this vicinity in the next 6 to 12 hours. So that is something to keep a close eye on in the hours to come. Here you can see the extent of red flag warnings, and I'll zoom out. Some of these are for lightning. Well, in California anyway, the purple regions, or the pink regions I should say, are exclusively for lightning in these regions. So these are essentially dry lightning related red flag warnings. But if we zoom out, it's actually related to a combination of heat anomalous heat and lightning up in the Pacific Northwest. So there's actually quite a few new fire ignitions we're seeing up in the Pacific Northwest today, some of which are related to lightning. Again, you can see the concentration of them really in this region, far northern California, southern Oregon, but there are others where there hasn't been as much lightning. Those are more heat and dryness related. Also, red flag warnings more extensively across the Great Basin and southern Utah, where there are a number of large fires already burning. Fire season is starting to kick into high gear. In some parts of the West, we're not there yet fully. In all parts of California in particular, we're not there yet along the coast of California. There is not high fire risk even right now, but that is starting to change across the interior and inland parts of California. We've seen a lot of fire activity in the mountains of Southern California and the high deserts in recent days as well. Looking at the pattern right now, what we can see, this is for this morning, a very clearly defined low pressure system off the coast. As I mentioned on satellite, that's bringing in some moist and unstable air that's creating thunderstorm risk in this region in particular. As we go through, this is again the European ensemble prediction. As we go through the next few days, that low pressure system moves to the east, is replaced by an even weaker new one. The 4th of July looks pleasantly cool, maybe a bit breezy, but probably nothing too dramatic, which is nice. A calm 4th of July, perhaps a good thing this year of all years. But then look what happens next. And this has been in the cards now for a number of days. Been watching this. Another weak low may form later in the week, but then as we get toward July 9th and 10th, a very strong signal for pronounced four corners high pressure builds. This is now less than 10 days in the future, so it's a little less speculative given that there's quite strong multi-model ensemble agreement. This very strong high pressure system will begin to advect hot air aloft into California from the south and east. And there will be a concurrent ridge also along the Pacific Northwest coast going into Canada. So this is a broad strengthening of the western periphery of the Four Corners High. And again, this isn't quote-unquote just summer. By definition, just summer is this region here, right around zero, because this is a normalized anomaly map. What is the departure from average for this time of year? Anywhere where you see red or orange, especially where it's red and orange as opposed to light orange, is well above average, and this means the atmosphere is much thicker and warmer than it usually is, even given the time of year, and even given the long-term warming trend. So this is a pretty strong signal from the European model. The American model ensemble looks similar. This is a major heat wave signal. So this could potentially bring widespread above average temperatures, and this is essentially what we see on this map. The whole West is really hot. And one thing I wanted to point out for some folks, this has been on the comments section of the Weather West blog, this little region of blue blob right along the coast here, this is an artifact of the plotting scheme. This does not mean, in this case, that the model is actually projecting far above average temperatures here and below average temperatures here. This is related to the placement of the coastline in the model world versus reality and the difference in resolution between the two. You can kind of see a similar artifact down here. There's nothing magic about the west coast of Baja California that makes it warmer than average right here. So don't read too much into the red-blue noise right along the coast. The bigger picture here is that this is a major heat wave signal, and that is reflected by what we see in general moving forward in the west. In fact, that heat signal then persists as we go into mid-July. So a pretty strong ridge signal and heat signal remaining. If I look back at the geopotential height anomalies, again, it actually shows toward mid-July, at the very end of the 15-16 day ensemble run, this ridge rebuilding into California and the Pacific Northwest. The other thing I wanted to mention is this, and this is the final thing I'll mention here before looking at the comments. This is not just a California issue in the coming days, but in fact, as we move forward into July, as we get to mid-July, which is right around here, we see that this pronounced ridging is not only true in the desert southwestern California, but also in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. In fact, it builds even further as we go later into July, becoming quite uniformly intense. Well, maybe not uniformly intense, but there is broad ridging across western and central Canada as well as California, with above average temperatures extending across a really broad region as we go forward later into July. So this is the last 5 days of the model run on average from July where is it, 11th through 16th. This is a really big region of above average temperatures in the western US and Canada. And if we look at the precipitation outlook for that period, not that California usually gets much precipitation, so you're going to see a lot of white. But importantly, if you look at this region over the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada, you can see that conditions are quite a bit drier than average in the coming weeks. Given the wildfire season we've already seen up in this part of Canada in recent weeks, this is an alarming sign for what is coming. Very hot, very dry. The Pacific Northwest, which does tend to see some rainfall in June and July usually, remaining much drier and much hotter than average as well. So I think we're going to see a pretty dramatic escalation in fire season in the days to come, but particularly starting around July 9th. So fortunately, the 4th, with all of those fireworks-related human wildfire ignitions, doesn't look particularly bad. In fact, it actually looks cooler than average in California. Still, be careful out there. But once we get past that point, watch out. It looks like the first widespread severe heat event of the season may be on the horizon, which, if there are a significant number of wildfire ignitions from this event, that could be a problem if they persist. So I'll just take a quick look at the radar again. The overall picture looks similar. Again, that cell up by Weaverville generating a lot of lightning, but also a fair bit of rain. So that might not be one of the ones that produces the most fire activity. Okay, I do want to answer some questions. You will see here let me just quickly toggle off so you'll see me back to full screen. So, okay. All right, so another sip of water. Again, thanks for sharing the channel. It always helps. Okay. So, Lisa mentions, I can see developing cumulus looking toward the east over the Santa Ana Mountains. So obviously that's in Southern California, Orange County, or Orange County adjacent, I guess, depending on which part of the Santa Ana Mountains. There is some cumulus development down there. Probably won't progress to thunderstorms with this round down there, but this season is young. There will probably be further opportunities later in the summer. Megan mentions that there was a lightning strike this morning in Sacramento. So random. There was a brief bout of elevated convection that dropped a few lightning strikes from the central Sacramento Valley, from about Sacramento over into the Winters area, Davis, northern Napa. That could happen again later today into tonight. It's a slight chance, but 10-20% chance is not negligible, and it's certainly higher than the baseline 0% chance on an average day this time of year. So would not be totally astonished if something like that happened again. There's a question further down. Dry thunderstorms in the North San Francisco Bay Area? Probably not, although there is a slight chance in the North Bay, and in particular in northern Sonoma and northern Napa County. So the farther north you go, the higher the likelihood. There's maybe like a 2 to 5% chance Central Bay Area, so I wouldn't count on it. A slightly higher chance in the far North Bay, with a much higher chance up in Mendocino, Lake counties, kind of northward. We're already seeing some in those places as I speak. Yeah, Alyssa also mentions that there are fires burning in Southern California. None of them are huge. Some of them have forced some evacuations, but again, they're in this environment, in the lack of extreme heat or wind, they are largely manageable. And the abundance of firefighting resources that remains available for now, because the whole West hasn't lit up all at once yet, even though that is, again, a strong expectation seasonally, unfortunately. It's going to be easier to manage what's popping up right now. Doesn't mean it's necessarily great if you live nearby, but it does mean that this is not the kind of extreme fire scenario that we're concerned about later in the season this year. There's one person mentioning volume problems again, by the way. I have worked really hard. It should be perfect right now, so if you're having volume problems and you're someone other than LK who originally mentioned it, please let me know. But this should be crystal clear right now. I do need people to tell me if there are problems with volume, by the way. I don't have any immediate way to discern, although because on my end it actually looks quite optimal. So that's the best I can tell. A lot of folks checking in with their personal experience with some of these federal cuts. It's really frustrating how widespread these anecdotes are. I mean, certainly it's affected many of my colleagues, and unfortunately, we're on a path for it affecting a lot more of them, as I was talking about earlier. Yeah, there's several comments regarding the August 2020 event, the dry lightning event that has given a fair number of people in California either figurative or in some cases literal post-traumatic stress. And just clarifying that there's a wide range, a wide spectrum of dry lightning events and consequences from dry lightning events, and August 2020 was at the very upper end both of the actual spectrum when it comes to the sheer number of lightning strikes, the sheer intensity of the thunderstorms that produce them. They produce 60 to 70 mile an hour winds in some places, and in the extraordinary record-breaking drought conditions that precipitated the hundreds of fires that ignited. So that was and remains a historically exceptional event. The vast majority of dry lightning events will not be that consequential. On the other hand, as we see more flammable environments, if we do see an extreme dry lightning event like that again, the odds that it occurs under conditions that are highly conducive to the ignition of numerous wildfires is going up over time. We don't have August 2020 like dryness out there in the landscape anywhere in California right now. Anywhere. Not even close. So the risk is not currently, even if we did have a lightning event like that, the outcomes would likely be less severe, although they would still be problematic. Later this year, though, I am keeping a close eye on any major widespread dry lightning events that occur, especially in August or September, maybe even as late as October, because that is when conditions will be probably not as dry as 2020, but getting closer. So that is when I will be a lot more concerned about dry lightning events should they occur. I'm glad the volume seems to be good for most folks, so hopefully at least the baseline volume is now high enough that if you do think it's too low, you should be able to crank it up on your device now. The problem previously was even the baseline was so low that people were maxing out their volume sliders and it wasn't enough. But the input and the output should be high enough that you can just crank it up should you need to do so on your own personal device. Okay, I'll do a final call for questions. I'll devote another 3 or 4 minutes to it. Any last questions about anything I've talked about today? And then I'm going to wrap this one up. So I'll leave it open for just a minute or two, since I know there's about a 10 or 15 second lag between when I say this and when it actually shows up on the live stream. Give some people a few minutes to type as I take one more sip of water. And just to reflect as well, that I do really appreciate the viewership that essentially peaks, I think, on a lot of the days where I'm talking about contemporaneous weather events. So the weather and climate events of the day, the wildfire events. I encourage folks to stick it out for the other conversations as well. When I'm talking about some of the science that's behind the scenes in weather and climate and wildfire. Often those sessions are far less well attended, by the way. So your likelihood of getting direct interaction and getting your personal question answered is always higher on the non-acute weather days, simply because there's a lower ratio, at least so far, of people live on the stream asking questions and my ability to answer them. All right. Well, I don't see too many new questions coming in, so I think I might call it for the day. Depending on how things go this week, we can predict some parts of the future, but not all of it. So we will see how it goes, and I may or may not have another live stream depending on both how the weather evolves and also how the rest of the world evolves in the days to come. So thanks for joining, and I will see you next time. As always, this session will be recorded if you missed any of it, so please do feel free to share the recording with others. I know there's a lot of folks who like to watch it after the fact. So thanks again, and talk to you next time.